Hello everybody, Adam here. Welcome. Here we share true stories from real people. Today, starting out with the first story. My mother and stepfather kicked me out when my half-sister was born because now they had a real daughter. Years later, I got my revenge. I was 25 years old, and it had been 6 years since I was thrown out when my mother was 45, and my stepfather was 49, and they had my half-sister. My mother had me when she was very young. Her parents and grandparents were extremely traditional and strict, so they forced her to have me. She didn't even want to tell them she was pregnant, but unfortunately, my father didn't know and told them before she could say anything. From what I've heard, she took a pregnancy test, and as soon as she saw the positive result, he called her parents and told them everything, thinking it was news she'd want to share with them. He didn't even wait to ask her, which was pretty stupid on his part, but that's my dad for you. Needless to say, they broke up shortly after, and since they were never married, it was a lot easier. My parents met in college and were together for a year when they got pregnant, but after my dad's stupidity, my mom left him, but she couldn't leave me because her family knew, and they said if she aborted, they'd disown her. So, she had to go through with it. I know this story because she's told me many times and always reminded me how lucky I am to be alive today, because if it were up to her, she'd never have had me. It's really fun hearing that from your mom. She insisted I was the result of my dad's stupidity, which made her even more annoyed with me than usual. So I was raised to be as invisible as possible. My grandparents and great-grandparents made sure I was born, but they didn't account for what would happen to me afterward. My childhood is hard to describe. You know how my mom was, but my dad wasn't much better. My mother resented me because she didn't want me, and wouldn't have had me if it weren't for her family's pressure. She also believed I was the reason she couldn't advance further in her career, because she had to take care of me while juggling college and work, which is fair, I guess. But resenting me just for being born and treating me poorly as a child seems a bit much. Don't get me wrong, I didn't lack anything material as a child because my grandparents paid for everything since my dad couldn't afford child support. So I had everything I wanted, but I always felt like a burden to my mother, and she never did anything to make me feel otherwise. She never spoke kindly to me, never showed any affection, and even when I accomplished something, she never celebrated with me. It was like living with a grumpy older roommate who hated you for no reason and just wanted you gone as soon as possible. And then there's my dad. He was much sweeter and kinder than my mother, but he was just as inept as a parent, and I'm pretty sure he had some drug issues when I was younger. I couldn't recognize it then, but now I'm certain he was a pothead. He always did weird things and said strange stuff, but I dismissed it because he mostly tried to be funny, and I didn't think much of it. He attended all my birthday parties and had dinner with us once a month, but my mom also seemed to hate him, and I always overheard them arguing about his behavior. My mother didn't want me, but she kept me because her family decided my father wasn't capable of taking care of me, and honestly, they weren't wrong. They had to decide who would raise me before I was born, and my mother's family made sure she'd be responsible, while my dad could only see me on weekends. But even that was only allowed after a certain age. Before I turned 10, I lived with my mother full-time and saw my dad a few times a month. But after that, I was allowed to live with him on weekends, which was a step backward because after I turned 10, I realized my dad definitely wasn't ready to be my dad. He lived in a small apartment, and it was clear he couldn't live the lifestyle my mom was used to because he was living in poverty, and his living room reeked of weed. I also knew he couldn't hold down a job for long because my mother constantly complained about it. She kept telling me that if my dad weren't such a complete idiot, she could at least let me stay with him half the week instead of just weekends without feeling pressured by the family about it. At my dad's house, I felt okay, but not comfortable, because I knew being there put him in a tough spot since he clearly couldn't live on just one meal a day like he did. But still, he tried to make me feel better when I was at his place. That's how my childhood went. I had to endure my mother's constant reminders that I wasn't welcome in her house while living with her. And on weekends, I had to deal with my dad's situation and his condition. Then when I was around 15, my mother started dating my stepfather, Jeffrey. He wasn't a bad guy, but he wasn't good either. He was just indifferent to me, and honestly, that was better than my parents. He didn't talk to me, I didn't talk to him, and everything was peaceful. Anyway, they were together for a few years, and then when I was 17, they got married. 2 years later, they announced they were having a baby, and it didn't really bother me because it had nothing to do with me. I kept living my life and following my routine as usual, but I had no idea what was coming. When I turned 18, I decided to take a year off instead of going to college to gain work experience first. I regret that decision. I should have gone to college when I had the chance because my grandparents were willing to pay for it. But a few months after my 18th birthday, my mom and her parents had a huge argument over some nonsense that I don't even remember, and they stopped talking to each other. This also meant they stopped sending me money, and I was on my own. But luckily, I was interning at the time, so I was making a little money. By the time I turned 19, I started applying to colleges, and my mom was 7 months pregnant. Even then, she didn't tell me what was going to happen when my half-sister was born. However, just a week after my half-sister was born, and my mom returned home from the hospital, she and Jeffrey told me they had something important to discuss with me. I was a little surprised because I couldn't imagine anything my mom would say to me leading to something good. When they started talking to me, they said they needed a room in the house because now that my half-sister was born, they were going to hire a full-time nanny and needed a room for her to stay in. There was the master bedroom, where my mom and Jeffrey stayed, my room and the guest room. But my mom told me they were going to repaint the guest room and turn it into a nursery. And of course, they couldn't let anyone stay in their bedroom. So it was time for me to move out because I was 19 years old. And as an adult, I had no reason to keep living with my parents because it was getting weird and they needed their privacy. I found it pretty shocking because even though I was legally an adult, I still needed a home because eventually I would need to return from college, and then I would need a place to go. I told my mother, and she said whenever I needed to come home, I could stay with my father. But that wasn't possible because by then, my dad was deep into his addictions. Not only did he have drug problems, which was bad enough, even if it was just weed, but he also had a gambling addiction, and his home was simply not a place anyone would want to go. And clearly, I couldn't live with my grandparents because they didn't like my mother, and if they didn't want to talk to her, there was no chance they'd want to talk to me because, to them, I was just an extension of my mother. This is also why I never had to worry about money before, because my grandparents wanted to take care of my mother, so they also took care of me. But once their relationship ended, so did ours, and I knew this because I had tried to reach out to them several times, but had no luck. Getting kicked out was bad enough, but I also had to start thinking about how I would pay for my college education because when I applied, I simply assumed my mother would do that for me. I knew she hated me, but I thought going to college would mean I'd be out of her hair in her life, so she'd help me with that. When she told me she was kicking me out, I asked her if she was willing to pay for my college. She just laughed in my face and said she wasn't just kicking me out but cutting all ties with me because she had served her sentence, and now that she wasn't even in touch with her parents, she had no reason to keep me around. I was shocked that someone could be so cruel, and I ended up crying, but she just frowned and told me if I was going to cry, she'd prefer I do it outside the house because I was ruining the atmosphere of what should be a happy day. Before that day, I had never said anything back to my mother because I simply didn't want to argue with her or waste my time. But that day, I decided to stand up for myself because I wasn't going to get kicked out of the house in silence. I was going to go out kicking and screaming, but I was going to let her know exactly what I thought of her. I told her she was a terrible mother and always had been, and I was really glad to finally be free of her and that my life would be much better without her. To that, she just turned around and told me she didn't care about any of that and just wanted me gone because now that she and her husband had a real daughter, they didn't need me anymore. and I was as unwanted as ever, if not more so. So I broke down again, and I think that was really the worst day of my life. But after a while, I collected myself, packed my things, and left that house, never looking back. After leaving, I went straight to my dad's place and knew that whatever state he was in, I'd fix it and do my best for my situation, because I wasn't going to let my parents and their neglectful attitudes ruin my life. When I got there, I realized my dad's condition was terrible, and his house was even worse. I couldn't even tell when it had last been clean based on its appearance, and there was trash scattered all over the floor. He probably hadn't showered in days. That's when I found out he hadn't had a job in nearly a year. He kept losing because of his gambling addiction. He was lucky that his father had passed away a few months ago and left him some money that he was now wasting. As soon as I got to my dad's place, he tried to tell me he was glad to see me, but he was too high to say anything. He just smiled at me, thinking that was enough. But I wasn't in the mood. I had a really bad day and simply couldn't take it anymore. He had a joint he was smoking. So, I walked up and snatched it from his hand because I wanted to make sure he stepped up as a father and did everything for me that he hadn't done all my life. I wasn't going to let his bad habits ruin my life. So I told him I was here for good because my mom had kicked me out, and now he had to make up for what he hadn't done for me and actually change his ways. He thought I was joking and tried to pick up his joint from the floor, but that's when I snapped and finally slapped my dad across the face. I regret it. I shouldn't have done that, but I lost my mind over my future and lost sight of what was important at that moment. But it didn't lead to anything bad, so I guess it had to happen. When I slapped him, I immediately started apologizing, but he got really angry and retreated to his room, slamming the door. There was only one room, so I decided to stay in the living room. But the next morning, he came to me and asked exactly what had happened the night before. He was sober then, so I told him everything in great detail and said I needed his help now and wanted him to improve his life because I wanted a better future for myself, and to do that, I'd need his help and cooperation. So he couldn't just gamble and do drugs all the time like before. He was a bit surprised to hear that my mother had kicked me out and called her to ask about it, but she didn't answer. So that was the day I decided I would live with him, and since he had no money, he couldn't afford to send me to college. But he promised me he'd do his best to be a better father to me because that slap had really woken him up in a big way. It wasn't easy, and it was a tough battle from that moment on, and my dad had many relapses into his old habits over the next few years. But I stood by him, and he promised me he'd keep trying to get better. I couldn't go to college, but I couldn't waste time sitting at home either, so I decided to apply for internships at several companies, and I got accepted at a few. They paid decently, but not enough to support a good lifestyle or pay for college, because if I applied to college, I'd have to quit and give up my internships, and then I wouldn't have any money. I wasn't ready to take out student loans because at that time, I wasn't sure if my dad would improve his life, and I didn't want to dig myself into a hole I couldn't get out of. So I focused on working, and when I wasn't working, I was doing housework because the house needed to be clean, and I couldn't let my dad live the way he had been. I wasn't the only one looking for work. My dad was doing the same, but because he hadn't worked in a long time and had a bad reputation from previous employers who didn't like him because he was always high at work, getting a job was harder for him than for me, and that also made him much more frustrated because his daughter was bringing home money, but he wasn't, and that definitely irritated him. However, neither of us had anywhere else to go, so despite everything, we had to stick together and work things out. And finally, about 3 years ago, something amazing happened to us. My dad was working as a store manager, but he was paid very little, and the hours were long while I was working as an accountant, and they paid me slightly more, but it was a very boring desk job. However, a friend of mine who lived in another state told me that her dad was expanding his business and opening a new branch in my city. This friend of mine had known me since we were in high school together. Her parents got divorced, and she moved to another state with her dad, but she came back every year for vacations to see me, and that was something we usually did. She knew all about me and the problems I'd been going through for the past few years. She even offered to help pay for my college, but I couldn't accept money from her because then I'd know I owed her money, and I couldn't live with that. I turned down her and her dad's money, even though they were more than willing to help me, and were quite wealthy because her dad had a large office supplies business. Recently, they decided to expand, and she contacted me to let me know she had a job offer for me because she knew I was looking for something. I was a bit scared that she was doing this as a favor for me, so I asked her about it. She said her dad normally wouldn't consider someone my age for a position like this. She convinced him because she knew I could do it, and simply had the determination and ambition. She believed in me and knew I was capable of handling it. Technically, it was a favor, but she assured me she also had faith in me, which is why she helped me with this. So she offered me a position as their company liaison, and I was thrilled to accept the position, which paid much more, and I'd have to work longer hours, but I was happy to do it. I also asked if they had a spot for my dad, and based on his qualifications and previous work experience, they decided to hire him as a warehouse manager because he had experience in that field and had done that job before. So we were set, and it was the first time something good had happened to us. Since then, everything has just gotten better, and my dad and I are now much better off. He's completely off marijuana and no longer gambles. We moved into a much nicer house, in a better neighborhood, and have been living here for 2 years now. Things are going so well, and I really couldn't ask for more. 6 years ago, I couldn't have imagined myself being in this place. As for my mother, I haven't been in contact with her since I left the house, and I have no idea what she's been doing all these years. But 2 weeks ago, she reached out to me, saying she needed my help. She sounded pretty desperate, and I could guess that something serious had happened, so I decided to listen to her. Apparently, my mother quit her job right after I left, and she and Jeffrey started their own business, but unfortunately, it went badly for a long time, and I don't know why, but they kept investing in it and putting money into something they knew they wouldn't get a return on. So, surprise, surprise, they finally went bankrupt, accrued a lot of debt, and had to sell everything to pay back all the people they borrowed money from. But then they failed. My mother heard from a relative that my dad and I had moved into a better house, so she assumed we were doing very well now. So she thought it would be a good idea to call me and ask for help. She didn't even apologize. She just said we should leave the past behind and put aside our differences because this wasn't just about her. She had a little daughter and her future was at stake, so if I had any kindness in me, I'd help them out and pay off some of their debt. I thought she was pretty bold to ask me for help after what she did to me, and just to mess with her, I decided to agree with her over the phone and go along with it. But honestly, I had no intention of giving her any money or paying off any of her debts. However, I still told her I'd consider it and help her out, just because I felt petty. So for a few days, I strung her along and talked to her every day, while she told me about their finances and all that. I listened, knowing I wouldn't contribute anything, and it was all just a ruse. But she didn't know that, and I kept hoping she'd apologize or something, but that apology never came, and that made me feel a lot less guilty about what I was about to do. And then 2 days ago, she finally asked when I was going to send the money. So I told her the truth that I wasn't going to send her any money, and that she had been fooled. I reminded her of everything she had done to me over the years. Not just that, but also how she had treated me throughout my childhood. She was stupid to expect me to help her after everything that happened, and she didn't even apologize, so she had no reason to expect anything from me. She was a terrible person and a terrible mother, and I was sure everyone knew that. So, I hung up before she could say anything, and I posted about it all online. I shared my whole story, even the part about my mother coming to me 2 weeks ago, begging for help and acting like she was entitled to my money and contributions. She was ridiculous and stupid, and I wanted everyone to know that, so that's why I did it. Personally, I didn't see anything wrong with it, but my dad thinks I went too far and shouldn't have done it, I don't know how my mother reacted because after that phone call, I pretty much blocked her everywhere. But I know my relatives can still see the post. And everyone who knows my mother now knows what she did to me during my childhood. I think it was necessary to expose my mother because she always pretended to be such a kind person and a successful career woman. But now it's all a lie, and I think I did the right thing. But my dad thinks I shouldn't have said anything and just ignored her the first time she reached out to me for help instead of going along with it and all that because it was cruel. And I'll admit, it was cruel, and that was the point behind it. She was cruel to me my entire life. I think it's only fair, and I'm not in a movie. I don't have to do the right thing and set an example for others. I can do whatever I want. But anyway, my dad thinks I went too far and now insists that I should apologize. So, am I the bad one for promising my toxic mother that I'd help her pay off her debt, then backing out at the last minute and exposing her online? Update 1. Hi. So, I took the advice of most of you and decided to sit down with my dad to talk about it. It worked out, which is great. Honestly, he wasn't really an active parent during most of my childhood. He was always high and didn't seem to care about anything. He clearly didn't remember most things. But then I reminded him of how my mother used to treat me, and basically I had no one because even though he liked having me around, he wasn't really there for me. That made him realize that what I did came from the anger and resentment I had built up over the years. So what I did wasn't the right thing, and it certainly wasn't ethical or moral. But if it gave me an outlet for the frustration and anger I'd been holding in for so long, then maybe it was good for me. So he understood and stopped saying I needed to apologize to my mother. She never apologized to me for everything she put me through, and on top of that, she had the audacity to expect me to help her. That's a whole different level of arrogance. She hasn't reached out to me since then. It's been almost a week. I know people are talking about it because I've gotten a lot of messages asking about my mother, but I really don't have any interest in talking to others about it. I posted everything I had to say. I have nothing more to add, plus I have a lot of work to do now, so I don't have time for this drama. What's done is done, and now it's over. Update 2. So my mother finally reached out to me from a new number today after almost 2 weeks of no contact. She didn't have much to say. She just told me that she should never have trusted me and regrets having a daughter like me. But that's fine. The feeling is mutual. I also regret having a mother like her, and would rather have been an orphan than have had the childhood I did with her. She told me that thanks to my little post, she can no longer live in this city and has decided to move because she's so ashamed and embarrassed. So, I finally got what I wanted, according to her. But honestly, I don't really care where she lives. I haven't been in contact with her for years, and I don't care where she resides. So, that's where she's really wrong, but that's okay. She's a narcissist and tends to make everything about herself. So, this isn't a huge surprise. Anyway, I'm glad she's moving, and I don't have to talk to her anymore because she's blocked me. Update 3. Hey. So it's been a month since my mother moved, and things have been quiet. We're no longer in contact, but I've heard from some relatives that she seems to have cut ties with the entire family and isn't talking to anyone. I guess that's good for her. My dad and I are still doing well. In fact, my dad just got a raise, so things are still going smoothly. And I can't complain. As for my post, I deleted it. It caused all the damage it needed to, and I don't see any point in keeping it up. If anything else happens, I'll come back with another update. Update 4. This update is just to share some more things about my mother that I've heard. Apparently, she's in the process of divorcing her husband, Jeffrey. At first, I was a little surprised, but then I remembered how she is, and it's not surprising at all. I don't have much good to say about Jeffrey either, but given their personalities, I thought they'd be a match in some way. What concerns me a bit more is that some acquaintances have told me that my mother is expressing concern for me. They said she's worried about my situation because I'm her daughter, despite everything. Weird, right? After everything that's happened between us, she still feels the need to be concerned about me. But honestly, I find it hard to believe in her genuine concern, given her history. That's something I'm not interested in anymore, and I hope it's not another ploy to get money out of me. I also hope she's not going after my dad now that he's doing better. Anyway, I'll keep moving forward in my life, focusing on work and maintaining a healthy relationship with my dad. The only thing I'm worried about is my half-sister, because growing up with a mother like that isn't easy. I just hope she treats her better than she treated me. At least she's wanted. I say that not out of jealousy, although it might sound like it, but because I genuinely worry for her, even though there's not much I can do.